When 10-year-old Henry Odell walked into the Reggiano family restaurant with a swollen eye and whispered, "Please be my dad," the room went silent. 20 men in tailored suits stopped mid-conversation. What happened next didn't just change one boy's life, it shook an entire city's underworld. This is a story about the family we choose and the unexpected moment when criminals became heroes. The heavy door of Reggiano's swung open on a Tuesday evening, letting in a gust of cold Manhattan air and something nobody in that room expected. A child. Henry stood in the doorway, backpack hanging off both shoulders, his sneakers worn through at the toes and 2 sizes too small. The golden light from the street lamps behind him made his small silhouette look even more fragile against the restaurant's dark, mahogany interior. The conversations died mid-sentence. Whiskey glasses paused halfway to lips. Someone turned down the Frank Sinatra playing softly in the background. 20 men in expensive suits, men whose names appeared in federal investigations and whose presence cleared rooms, stared at the 10-year-old who'd just walked into their world uninvited. Vince Reggiano, the family patriarch, set down his cigar slowly, his dark eyes sharp despite the gray threading through his temples. His gaze locked onto the boy's face. That's when he saw it. The purple bruise blooming around Henry's left eye, swollen nearly shut, fresh enough that the edges still carried angry shades of red and yellow. "You lost, kid?" Luca called from the corner booth, his tone more curious than threatening, though his hand had instinctively moved closer to his jacket. Henry's throat bobbed. His small hands twisted the straps of his backpack until his knuckles went white. For a second, Vince thought the boy might bolt, run back into the street and disappear into the New York night like he'd never been there at all. But then Henry straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin, and said the words that would crack open something in every man in that room. "Can you be my dad for one day?" The silence that followed carried weight, the kind of heavy, pressing quiet that spoke of buried memories and childhood wounds that never quite healed. Vince's eyes found Dario first, foster care kid who'd aged out of the system alone at 18. Then Martha, standing by the bar, whose father had vanished before she learned to walk. Luca's hand unconsciously touched his ribs where his old man's belt had left permanent scars. "Career day," Henry continued, his voice steadier now, as though speaking the words aloud gave him courage. "At my school, Franklin Elementary. It's next Friday. Everyone's bringing their parents to talk about their jobs." He paused, swallowed hard, his small Adam's apple bobbing. "I don't have anyone to bring." Vince stood slowly, his leather chair creaking. The movement drew every eye in the room. When Vince Reggiano stood, people paid attention. He moved around the table with deliberate calm, each step measured, until he stood 5 feet from the boy. "What about your folks?" Vince's voice was gentler than anyone outside this room would believe possible. "My real dad died." Henry's voice didn't waver, but his eyes went distant, looking at something only he could see. "Car accident, 3 years ago. And my mom's boyfriend." He stopped, fingers unconsciously touching the swollen eye. "He's not really the career day type." Dario moved closer, crouching to Henry's eye level with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years reading body language for survival. "That shiner, how'd you get it?" "Fell off my bike." "Try again, kid." Henry's carefully constructed facade crumbled like paper in rain. "John, that's my mom's boyfriend. He gets mad when she's at work and she works a lot. Double shifts at the hospital." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Yesterday I forgot to put my shoes away. He said I was clumsy and stupid and that my real dad would be ashamed of me." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Luca's jaw clenched hard enough to make the muscle jump. Dario's knuckles went white around the beer bottle he'd been holding. Martha's eyes went cold and calculating, the look she got when planning something permanent. Vince felt something ignite in his chest. something protective and ancient and absolutely certain. He'd built an empire on fear and respect, but underneath it all, he remembered being small and powerless and desperate for someone, anyone, to see him. "And school?" Vince asked gently, though his hands had curled into fists at his sides. "How's that going?" Henry laughed, but there was no humor in it, just the hollow sound of a child who'd learned too young that the world wasn't kind. "There's this kid, Kyle. He and his friends corner me every day in the bathroom. They call me charity case and orphan boy, push me into lockers, steal my lunch money." He looked down at his shoes, which were held together with duct tape at the sides. "Last week they threw my dad's watch in the trash, the one my mom gave me after he died. I had to dig through garbage to find it." Vince remembered his own childhood, the hunger, the shame, the way loneliness could feel like drowning on dry land. He'd sworn when he took over this family that he'd use his power to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, that he'd never let another kid feel that powerless, not if he could help it. "Why us?" Martha asked, stepping forward from the bar. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held something fierce. "Why the Reggiano family?" "Because you're not afraid of anyone." Henry's eyes were bright now, urgent, desperate. "Kyle's dad is some big developer, has connections, money, nobody stands up to them, but you—" He gestured around the room at men whose reputations preceded them, whose names made politicians nervous and cops careful. "Everyone respects you. Everyone's a little scared of you." His voice cracked slightly. "I thought maybe if you came, just for one day they'd leave me alone. I'd have someone in my corner." That last sentence hit Vince like a physical blow. Someone in my corner. Such a simple request. Such an impossible dream for a kid who'd learned that the adults in his life either disappeared or used their hands for hurt instead of protection. The men looked at each other. No words were spoken, but entire conversations happened in those glances. Years of shared history, of understanding what it meant to grow up without protection, of remembering what it felt like to be Henry. They'd all been him once. Scared, alone, desperate for someone to see them as worth saving. Before I tell you what they did next, do me a favor. Hit like and subscribe, because trust me, you're going to want to see how this ends. Vince made his decision. "Friday, you said?" His voice carried the quiet authority that had built an empire. Henry nodded, hope flickering across his face like dawn breaking. "Yes, sir, 9:30, room 204. Vince turned to his family, his real family, the men and women who'd stood beside him through wars and losses and the bloody business of survival. "Who's got Friday morning free?" Every single hand went up, Dario's, Luca's, Martha's, even the younger soldiers who usually handled enforcement. Every person in that room volunteered without hesitation. "All right then." Vince looked back at Henry, and for the first time in what looked like years, the boy smiled, small and tentative, but real. "We'll be there. All of us." Henry's eyes went wide, disbelief and hope warring on his young face. "Really? You mean it?" "Reggianos don't make promises we can't keep, kid." The smile grew wider, transforming Henry's bruised face into something that looked like joy, like maybe the world wasn't entirely cruel after all. "But Henry?" Vince's voice went serious, and the boy's smile faltered slightly. "This thing with John, this boyfriend who put hands on you, does your mom know?" The smile died completely. Henry's shoulders hunched inward, making him look even smaller. "She's so tired all the time, working double shifts to keep us in our apartment after Dad died. John helps with rent, and she—" His voice broke. "She doesn't know how bad it gets when she's gone. I don't want her to worry more than she already does." Vince nodded slowly. But his eyes met Martha's across the room. She understood immediately. This wasn't just about showing up at a school. This was about protecting a child from a man who'd proven he couldn't be trusted with power over someone weaker. "Okay, Henry." Vince placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. Careful, aware that touch might trigger fear after what he'd endured. Here's what's going to happen. Friday, we show up at your school, all 20 of us. We make sure Kyle and his friends understand you're not alone anymore. He paused, his grip tightening slightly. But after that, we're going to have a conversation about making sure you're safe, really safe, not just at school, understand? Henry looked up at him, this small, bruised child looking at a man whose reputation was built on violence, and somehow saw something that made him nod with trust instead of fear. "Thank you," Henry whispered. "Thank you so much." As Henry turned to leave, Vince called after him. "Kid, you hungry?" Henry's stomach answered before he could, a growl loud enough to echo in the quiet restaurant. "Martha," Vince said without looking away from Henry. "Get him a plate. Whatever he wants." "Already on it, boss." And as Henry sat at the bar, eating his first real meal in days while 20 of New York's most dangerous people watched over him like protective wolves, Vince pulled out his phone and began making calls, because Friday was about school. But tonight was about making sure John Odell understood that Henry wasn't alone anymore. And tomorrow? Tomorrow they'd start planning exactly how to ensure he never would be again. 3 weeks earlier. John Odell was the kind of man who looked good on paper. At 42, he had the polished appearance of someone who'd climbed the ladder through charm and calculated networking. Expensive haircuts, tailored suits for work, pressed khakis for weekends. He drove a silver BMW, owned a successful real estate development firm in Queens, and smiled at neighbors with the practiced warmth of someone who understood that image was everything. Mrs. Chen from 3B thought he was wonderful, always helping carry groceries, always asking about her grandchildren. The building superintendent called him a real professional, not like some of these other tenants. Even Henry's teacher, Mrs. Alvarez Kaist, had noted during parent-teacher conferences how engaged and concerned Mr. Odell seemed about Henry's education. Nobody saw what happened when the door to apartment 4C closed and the neighbors stopped watching. Nobody saw the monster. Henry had learned to read John's moods the way sailors read weather, by tiny signs most people missed. The way John's jaw clenched when he'd had a bad day at work, the specific tone his voice took after his third beer, the dangerous silence that fell when Henry made noise while John was on the phone. Tonight, the signs were everywhere. John sat at the kitchen table, tie loosened, empty beer bottles forming a small constellation around his laptop. His face had that tight, pinched look that meant someone had challenged him, contradicted him, made him feel small. Henry, doing homework at the counter, tried to make himself invisible, tried to be so quiet, so still, that maybe John would forget he existed. It didn't work. "Henry," John's voice was flat, dangerous. "Did you take out the trash like I told you?" Henry's stomach dropped. He'd forgotten. Too focused on finishing his math worksheet before his mom left for her night shift at the hospital, he'd completely forgotten about the trash. I'm sorry. I'll do it right now. I asked you a simple question." John stood, the chair scraping against linoleum. "Did you take out the trash?" "No, sir, but I can—" The backhand came fast, not hard enough to leave visible marks on the face, never that, but enough to send Henry stumbling against the counter. His math homework scattered across the floor. "What did I tell you about responsibility?" John's voice stayed level, almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. "What did I say would happen if you kept disappointing me? I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't cut it, kid. Sorry is what useless people say when they can't do simple tasks." John grabbed Henry's arm, the same spot he'd grabbed last week, where the bruises were still fading from yellow to green. His fingers dug in like claws. "Your real dad? He'd be ashamed of you. Man died serving his country, and his son can't even remember to take out garbage." Henry bit his lip to keep from crying. Crying made it worse. Crying meant he was weak and pathetic and deserved what he got. Get it done, now, and while you're at it, clean up this mess you made. John released him with a shove. Your mother works herself to death keeping a roof over your ungrateful head. Least you could do is not be completely useless. Henry gathered his homework with shaking hands, each movement careful, measured. He'd learned not to make sudden motions around John, learned to move like he was walking on glass. As he carried the trash bag down the apartment building's back stairs, he whispered the words he'd been repeating like a prayer for 3 years. Maybe if I was better, he wouldn't get so mad. Maybe if I just tried harder. Maybe if I was more like Dad, he'd... He stopped, because he didn't know how to finish that sentence. John would never love him. But maybe if Henry was perfect enough, quiet enough, invisible enough, John would at least stop hurting him. Later that night, after John had passed out on the couch and the apartment had fallen into uneasy silence, Henry sat on his bedroom floor with his crayons spread around him. His room was small, barely big enough for a twin bed, a small desk, and the cardboard box that held what few possessions he'd managed to keep from John's periodic cleaning sprees. Inside that box, his father's watch, the one Kyle had thrown in the trash, 3 photos from before Dad died, and a stack of drawings Henry had been making since he was 7. All the drawings were the same. A tall man in a suit, sometimes with dark hair like his real dad, sometimes different, holding a small boy's hand. Sometimes they were at a park, sometimes just standing together, but always the man's other hand rested protectively on the boy's shoulder. The caption was always the same too, written in Henry's careful print. Dad? Not a statement, a question. As if Henry wasn't sure what fathers were supposed to be anymore. As if the word itself had become uncertain, slippery, something that meant protection and love in his memories but pain and fear in his present. He picked up a blue crayon and started a new drawing. The man this time wore a dark suit and tie, the kind he'd seen businessmen wear in Manhattan. The boy stood beside him, not scared, not hunched, but straight and smiling. Maybe somewhere, Henry whispered to the empty room, there's a dad who doesn't hit, who doesn't yell, who actually wants me around. He'd almost finished the drawing when John's voice erupted from the living room like a thunderclap. Claire, did you move my phone charger? I swear to God, nothing stays where I put it in this place. But Claire wasn't home. She'd left for her shift 20 minutes ago. Wouldn't be back until 7 a.m. Which meant John's rage had nowhere to go except, Henry, get out here, now! Henry's hands shook as he shoved the drawing under his bed. He stood slowly, his body already tensing for impact, his mind already calculating escape routes if things got really bad. But when he opened his bedroom door and saw John's face, red with fury, eyes unfocused from alcohol, Henry knew this was different. This was worse. Where's your mother's jewelry box? John swayed slightly. The one with the pearl necklace. I know she keeps it in the closet. I don't know, sir. I've never touched... Don't lie to me! John lunged forward, and Henry's survival instincts finally overrode his fear-induced paralysis. He ran, down the hallway, grabbing his backpack from the hook by the door, out into the apartment building corridor, John's voice following him. You better be back here in 5 minutes or I'll... Henry didn't wait to hear the threat. He flew down 4 flights of stairs, burst through the building's front door into the cold October night, and kept running. He ran past Mrs. Chen's corner store, past the bodega where his mom bought groceries, past the playground where he used to go with his dad before everything changed. His lungs burned. His backpack bounced against his shoulders, but he didn't stop until his legs gave out 3 blocks away, leaving him gasping on a street corner he didn't recognize. Manhattan's lights blazed in the distance. Cars rushed past, their drivers sealed in their own worlds, oblivious to a small boy trying not to cry on the sidewalk. Henry pulled out his father's watch, miraculously still working despite its trip through school trash, and checked the time. 7:47 p.m. His mother wouldn't be home for 11 hours. He couldn't go back. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. He stood on shaking legs and started walking. No destination in mind, just the desperate need to be anywhere else. The streets blurred past. His feet carried him through neighborhoods that grew nicer, cleaner, more expensive with each block, until he found himself standing outside a restaurant with darkened windows and a single word above the door in elegant script, Reggiano's. Through the glass, Henry could see them, men in suits, the kind his dad used to wear. Men who looked powerful and dangerous and absolutely certain of their place in the world. Men who might, if he was very lucky, if he was very brave, understand what it meant to need protection from monsters who smiled at neighbors and saved their cruelty for when the door closed. Henry's hand found the door handle, and he pushed it open, letting the light spill out onto the street, letting himself step from one world into another. Not knowing that this single moment of desperate courage would change everything, not knowing that 20 strangers were about to become the family he'd been drawing in crayons for 3 years, not knowing that sometimes the most dangerous people in the world were the safest ones to trust. He only knew one thing for certain. He couldn't go home. And if he couldn't go home, he might as well try asking for a miracle, even if that miracle looked like the Mafia. The sound started at 8:47 a.m., a low rumble that grew steadily louder until it felt like the entire neighborhood was vibrating. Franklin Elementary sat on a quiet street in Queens, where the most exciting morning event was usually the crossing guard's whistle. But this Friday morning, something different was happening. 20 black SUVs turned onto Maple Street in perfect formation, their windows tinted dark, their chrome gleaming in the autumn sunlight. They moved with military precision, each vehicle exactly 3 car lengths behind the other, until they formed a line that stretched the entire block. Parents dropping off their children stopped mid-step. Teachers arriving for work froze on the sidewalk. Even the crossing guard lowered her stop sign, mouth hanging open. The lead SUV pulled up directly in front of the school's entrance. Then, like a choreographed performance, all 20 vehicles stopped simultaneously. For 3 seconds, nothing moved. Then every single door opened at once. Men emerged in tailored charcoal suits, crisp white shirts, dark ties. Polished shoes caught the morning light. Not a hair out of place, not a wrinkle in sight. They moved with the fluid confidence of people who'd spent their lives commanding respect through presence alone. From the lead SUV, Vince Reggiano stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced ease. He looked every inch the successful businessman, which, technically, he was. Just not the legal kind. The passenger door opened, and Henry climbed out, his backpack looking even more worn against the luxury of his surroundings. But his face was transformed. The swollen eye had been iced and treated by Martha last night, reduced to a fading bruise. More importantly, his expression held something it hadn't in years: hope. "Ready, kid?" Vince asked, his hand resting gently on Henry's shoulder. Henry nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. They walked toward the entrance, 20 men falling into formation behind them, not threatening, not aggressive, just present. A wall of suits and certainty that said without words, "This child is protected." On the steps, Mrs. Alvarez stood frozen, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. She recognized Henry. She did not recognize the small army accompanying him. "Good morning," Vince said pleasantly, as if arriving with a motorcade was perfectly normal. "We're here for career day. Room 204? Yes, second floor, left hallway." Mrs. Alvarez's voice came out squeaky. "Are all of you?" "Family," Vince said simply. They climbed the steps, and Henry felt something shift in his chest. Every time he'd climbed these steps before, he'd felt small, vulnerable, waiting for Kyle to appear around some corner. Now, with 20 men surrounding him like a protective shield, he felt safe. In the hallway, Students and teachers pressed against lockers as the procession passed. Whispers followed them like ripples. Who are they? Is that Henry Odell? Are those guys bodyguards? And then, from the water fountain, a voice Henry knew too well. What the? Kyle stood frozen, his Spider-Man juice box slipping from his fingers and hitting the floor with a wet splat. His usual crew of 3 friends had gone silent beside him, their faces pale. Henry didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just walked past with Vince's hand on his shoulder and 20 suited men at his back. For the first time in 3 years, Kyle looked away first. Room 204 was designed for 30 students and maybe 10 parent volunteers. It was not designed for what happened next. 20 men in dark suits filed in with quiet efficiency, positioning themselves along the walls when the chairs ran out. Some leaned against windows, others stood with hands clasped in front of them like Secret Service agents. The effect was somewhere between impressive and intimidating. Principal Morrison, a small woman with graying hair and 30 years of experience, looked like she was reconsidering her career choices. Well, she said, her voice only slightly shaky, this is certainly enthusiastic parent participation. Henry, would you like to introduce your guests? Henry stood at the front of the room, his voice stronger than it had been in months. This is my family. They came for career day. All of them? All of them. The presentations began. One by one, Henry's fathers stood to describe their professions. Luca went first, 6'2", hands like concrete blocks. I'm in transportation logistics, he said carefully. I drive for the family business, make sure important people get where they need to go safely. He didn't mention that important people sometimes meant witnesses who needed protection, or that safely occasionally involved evasive driving techniques learned from a former Army Ranger. Dario stood next, his chef's tattoos just visible under his cuffs. I run a restaurant in Manhattan. We specialize in traditional Italian cuisine and hospitality services. The money laundering part remained unspoken, but the passion in his voice when he described making fresh pasta was genuine enough to make the children smile. Martha, the only woman in the group, described family management and strategic planning, which was technically accurate if you didn't look too closely at what strategies she planned. Finally, Vince stood. The room seemed to shrink around his presence, not from menace, but from the sheer force of authority he carried like a second skin. I manage the family business, he said simply. We handle conflict resolution, asset protection, and community support. We make sure people who can't protect themselves have someone in their corner. He looked directly at Kyle, who was sitting 3 rows back and trying to become invisible. We take loyalty very seriously. And family, Vince's hand settled on Henry's shoulder again, is everything. The silence that followed was profound. Then, nervously, a parent started clapping. Another joined. Soon the whole room applauded, though half of them looked terrified and the other half looked confused about whether they should be terrified. Henry beamed like the sun had risen inside his chest. By noon, the video was everywhere. Someone's parent had filmed the arrival of the SUVs. Another had captured Vince's speech about family. Within hours, #Mafia Dads was trending nationally, the footage viewed millions of times. News outlets picked it up. Crime family shows up for bullied child's career day. Think pieces appeared. When the system fails, who protects our children? Social media exploded with debate, some calling it heartwarming, others questioning whether celebrating mob involvement with schools set a dangerous precedent. Vince watched the chaos unfold from his restaurant that evening, Martha standing beside him with her tablet showing the trending feeds. We're famous, she said dryly. The FBI's going to have a field day with this. Let them. Vince took a long drag on his cigar. We didn't break any laws, just showed up for a kids' school event. With 20 vehicles and enough manpower to stage a coup. Details. Vince watched the video of Henry's face when they'd arrived. The pure joy, the disbelief, the moment he'd realized he wasn't alone anymore. Was it worth it? Martha was quiet for a moment. Then, you saw Kyle's face. The kid will never touch Henry again. None of them will. Good. And John Odell? Martha's voice went cold. The boyfriend? Vince's expression hardened. That's next, but not yet. First, we make sure Henry's safe at school. Then, his smile carried no warmth. Then we have a conversation with Mr. Odell about the consequences of putting hands on children. Martha nodded, already planning. Want me to? No violence, Vince interrupted. Not yet. First, we watch. We document. We build a case so airtight that when we move, there's no question of justice. He looked out the window at the Queen's skyline, at the neighborhood where Henry lived in fear. That boy walked into our restaurant and asked for a father, Vince said quietly. He's got 20 now, and we protect our own. Martha smiled, sharp and dangerous. Always have, always will. The video kept playing on her tablet. 20 men, one small boy, a moment of protection that had somehow become a movement. Vince didn't care about trends or publicity or what the media said. He cared that somewhere in Queens, a 10-year-old boy was going to sleep tonight without fear for the first time in years. That was worth every camera, every question, every complication that followed. Because family, real family, wasn't about blood. It was about who showed up when no one else would, and the Reggianos always showed up. John Odell saw the video at 2:47 p.m., sitting in his office at Odell Development Group, pretending to review blueprints while nursing his third scotch of the afternoon. His phone buzzed. A text from a colleague. Dude, is this your kid? The link opened to 20 black SUVs and a small army of suited men escorting Henry up school steps like he was royalty. The views were already in the millions. The comments section exploded with speculation. Who are these guys? That's mob-level protection right there. Mafia dads is the energy we need. John's hands trembled as he scrolled. His perfect image, the respectable businessman, the concerned stepfather, the man who'd taken in his girlfriend's kid after the real father died, was cracking like glass under pressure. People were asking questions. His business partners were calling. His lawyer had left 2 voicemails asking about potential complications with your public profile. And underneath it all, the sick realization. Henry had told someone, had shown someone the bruises, had found protection from people who didn't care about John's money or connections or carefully constructed reputation. By the time John stumbled through the apartment door at 6:30 p.m., drunk and humiliated, his rage had built to something volcanic. Claire stood in the kitchen making dinner, her nurse's scrubs rumpled from a double shift. She turned at the sound of the door slamming, concern flickering across her tired face. John? Are you? Did you know? His words slurred slightly. Did you know what your brat did today? What are you talking about? This! He shoved his phone at her, the video still playing. 20 mobsters, at his school, making me look like some kind of... He couldn't finish, too angry to find words. Claire's face went pale as she watched. Henry did this? Who else? Kid went crying to criminals about his hard life. John's voice dripped venom. Made me look like a monster in front of the entire city. My partners are asking questions. Clients are concerned. Do you have any idea what this does to my reputation? Maybe if you hadn't... Claire stopped herself, but too late. Hadn't what? John stepped closer, and Claire instinctively moved back. Say it. Hadn't what, Claire? Nothing. I just meant... The slap came fast, snapping her head to the side. Not hard enough to leave lasting marks. John was always careful about that, but enough to make the point. You meant I'm the problem? John's voice went dangerously quiet. I put a roof over that kid's head, food in his mouth, and this is the thanks I get? Public humiliation? Claire held her cheek, tears forming but not falling. She'd learned years ago that crying made it worse. From the hallway, a small voice. Mom? Henry stood in his bedroom doorway, backpack still on, having just arrived home. His face drained of color as he took in the scene, his mother's red cheek, John's rage-twisted face, the familiar tension that meant violence was close. You! John turned on him. Get over here, now! 8 blocks away, Vince sat in his restaurant office, the viral video playing on loop on his laptop. He'd watched it 17 times now, not out of pride, but out of calculation. He was counting variables, identifying risks, planning contingencies. The door opened without knocking. Only Martha did that. You know what you've started? She held up her tablet showing news articles, social media debates, even a brief segment on CNN. The FBI's probably watching us closer than ever. Every cop in the city knows our faces now. You've made us visible, Vince. Visible is dangerous in our business. Vince exhaled cigar smoke slowly. Some things are worth the risk. A war with every law enforcement agency in New York? A war worth fighting. Vince closed the laptop. That boy needed help. We gave it. Whatever comes next, we handle. Martha studied him for a long moment. You're getting soft in your old age. Maybe. Vince's smile was thin. Or maybe I'm just tired of letting monsters win because we were too careful to intervene. Martha sat across from him, her tactical mind already shifting gears. What's the play? Protection. Quiet, subtle. We put eyes on the boy's apartment. Document everything. If John Odell so much as raises his voice wrong, we know about it. And then? Then we remind him that some children have guardians he can't bribe or intimidate. Vince reached for his phone. Get me Luca. By 11 p.m., Luca sat in a nondescript sedan, 2 buildings down from Henry's apartment, night vision binoculars in hand, notepad on the passenger seat. He'd been watching for 3 hours, seen John stumble home drunk, watched shadows move behind curtains, heard raised voices through the thin walls, not clear enough to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. At 11:47 p.m., he saw it. Henry's bedroom lights snapping on. The boy appeared at the window, visible for just a moment, his face tear-streaked, before the curtains closed again. Luca made a note. Subject distressed. Possible altercation. At 12:15 a.m., neighbors in 4B turned up their TV volume, drowning out whatever sounds came from 4C. They did it without looking toward Henry's door, without acknowledging what they were covering up. Luca recognized that gesture. The willful blindness of people who'd learned that getting involved meant becoming targets themselves. He made another note. Community complicit through fear. At 2:30 a.m., Claire emerged from the building, her nurse's uniform on, heading to work. Even from this distance, Luca could see the way she held herself, shoulders hunched, moving quickly, not looking at anyone. And he saw something else, a redness on her cheek that makeup hadn't quite covered. Mother also victimized, he wrote. Pattern of domestic violence confirmed. He called Vince. Boss, you were right. It's bad. How bad? Bad enough that I want to go up there right now and introduce John to the pavement. Luca's knuckles went white around the phone. But you said no violence? Yet. Not yet, Vince confirmed. Document everything. We need evidence when we move. And if the kid gets hurt while we're documenting? Vince was quiet for a long moment. Then document that too. And remind me that patience has limits. The next morning, Mrs. Alvarez sat in her classroom before students arrived, phone in her trembling hands. She'd been teaching for 15 years, seen dozens of troubled kids. made mandatory reports to child services when abuse was suspected. But yesterday, watching Henry's face light up with joy, surrounded by 20 protective men, she'd realized something. The system had failed him. She'd reported bruises twice before. Both times, the caseworkers had interviewed the family and closed the case, citing insufficient evidence. Both times, Henry had returned to school quieter, more withdrawn, more careful. This time would be different, she told herself. This time, she had proof: the viral video, her documented observations, photos she'd quietly taken of Henry's bruises over the past year. She dialed child services and filed a comprehensive report. Spoke for 20 minutes detailing everything she'd witnessed, everything she suspected. The caseworker promised immediate action. An investigation would begin within 48 hours. Mrs. Alvarez hung up feeling, for the first time in months, like she'd done something right. 24 hours later, Martha sat in Vince's office, her laptop open, her expression carved from ice. "The report disappeared," she said flatly. "Disappeared how?" "Completely. Like it never existed. I have contacts at child services, favors owed from years back. They confirmed a report was filed by Henry's teacher yesterday morning. By this morning, it was gone from the system. No investigation opened. No follow-up scheduled." Vince's cigar paused halfway to his lips. Someone buried it. Someone with access and authority. Someone who either owes John Odell a favor or is being paid well enough to look the other way. Martha's fingers flew across her keyboard. "I'm digging into Odell's connections. If there's corruption here, I'll find it." "How deep does it go?" Martha pulled up a file. Surveillance photos of John at expensive restaurants with city officials, text message logs Martha's people had intercepted, bank transfers that didn't quite add up. Deep enough that John thinks he's untouchable. He's got judges, caseworkers, even a few cops on his Christmas card list. She looked up. "This isn't just about one abusive boyfriend, Vince. It's about a network of people helping him stay hidden." Vince set down his cigar carefully. "Then we don't just take down John Odell." "No? We take down everyone protecting him." His voice went cold. "Every judge who looked the other way, every caseworker who buried reports, every person who chose money over protecting a child." Martha smiled, sharp and dangerous. "Now you're talking my language." Outside, Luca continued his vigil. 2 buildings down, Henry's window remained dark. And in apartment 4C, a 10-year-old boy whispered prayers to his dead father, asking for protection from monsters who smiled at neighbors and saved their cruelty for when no one was watching. But someone was watching now. And the Reggianos never forgot a debt, especially when it was owed in bruises that didn't fade. Martha had been digging through digital records for 48 hours straight, surviving on espresso and the particular fury that came from discovering how easily children could be failed by systems designed to protect them. What she found made her want to burn down half of Queens. "Vince." She walked into his office at 3 a.m. without knocking, her laptop open, dark circles under her eyes. "You need to see this." Vince looked up from the ledger he'd been reviewing, the legitimate one, not the other set. "Tell me." Martha set the laptop on his desk, pulling up a web of connections she'd mapped over the past 2 days. "John Odell isn't just some real estate developer with a temper, he's connected. Deep." She clicked through files. Judge Raymond Torres, family court, dismissed 2 previous abuse investigations against Odell. 3 months later, Odell Development Group gets the contract for Torres's daughter's wedding venue at half price. Another click. Patricia Mendez, senior caseworker at Child Services. She's the one who buried Mrs. Alvarez's report. Guess who just put a down payment on a condo in one of Odell's new developments, 20% below market value. Christ, Vince leaned forward, studying the connections. "It gets worse." Martha's voice went flat. "Captain Michael Brennan, NYPD. He's been redirecting domestic disturbance calls from Odell's building for 18 months. His brother-in-law works as Odell's head of security. Convenient, right? She pulled up bank records next. Transactions she'd acquired through methods Vince knew better than to ask about. Odell's paid out over $200,000 in consulting fees and gifts in the past 3 years. Every payment coincides with a complaint being filed and subsequently buried. Vince's hands curled into fists. He bought himself immunity. A whole system of it. Judges, cops, social workers, anyone who might investigate or intervene. He's been building this protection network since he started dating Claire. Martha's eyes went hard. Henry never had a chance. Every time someone tried to help, Odell's money made the problem disappear. Not anymore. Vince stood, pacing to the window. Can you prove all of this? Given time? Yes. I've got paper trails, witness statements from neighbors who were too scared to go on record before, and text messages between Odell and his bought officials. She paused. But Vince, if we expose this, it won't just be Odell who goes down. We'll be taking on judges, cops, city officials. This becomes very public, very messy. Good. Vince turned back to her. Let it be messy. Let every person who took his money and looked the other way face what they've done. Martha smiled grimly. I was hoping you'd say that. Later that morning, as Martha continued building the case, Vince found himself going through old files in his private safe, records from 15 years ago, back when the Reggiano family had been embroiled in a territorial war that had nearly destroyed them. He pulled out a folder marked Tenetti Betrayal and started reviewing photos, needing to verify something that had been nagging at him since Martha showed him Odell's connections. Then he saw it. A surveillance photo from 2008. Marco Tenetti, his former lieutenant, the man who'd sold out 3 of Vince's operations to a rival family before disappearing with $2 million. The betrayal had cost Vince 5 good men and nearly bankrupted the legitimate businesses they'd been using as fronts. But it wasn't Tenetti that made Vince's blood run cold. It was the man standing beside him at a construction site, shaking his hand with a smile. John Odell. Younger, less polished, but unmistakably him. The photo was dated March 2008, 2 years before Claire's husband died, 3 years before John entered their lives. Vince grabbed another photo from the file. Same year, different location. Tenetti and Odell at what looked like a planning meeting. Blueprints spread between them. Martha! Vince's voice carried through the restaurant. Get in here! She appeared seconds later. What? Vince showed her the photos. John Odell worked with Marco Tenetti. They were partners in some kind of development deal right around the time Tenetti betrayed us. Martha's eyes widened as she processed the implications. You think Odell was involved in the betrayal? I think it's too convenient to be coincidence. Tenetti vanishes with our money. 3 years later, Odell appears in Claire's life. A widow whose husband died in a car accident that was never properly investigated. Vince's voice went cold. What if Henry's real father didn't die in an accident? You think Odell killed him? I think Tenetti had connections to dirty contractors who could make accidents happen, and I think Odell needed Claire's husband out of the way for some reason we haven't figured out yet. Vince grabbed his phone. Get me everything you can find on David Connolly's death. Police reports, insurance claims, witness statements. If there's a connection between Tenetti, Odell, and that accident, I want it. Martha was already moving, her tactical mind shifting into high gear. If you're right, if Odell orchestrated Henry's father's death and then positioned himself to control Claire and whatever assets she had, then protecting Henry isn't just about saving a kid from abuse. Vince's expression went dark. It's about finishing something that should have ended years ago, about making sure Tenetti's last poisonous connection to my family gets severed permanently. He looked at the photos again. Young John Odell shaking hands with a traitor, both of them smiling like they owned the world. Personal now, Martha observed quietly. It was always personal. Vince's jaw tightened. Every time someone hurts a child who can't defend themselves, it's personal. But this, he tapped the photo. This is about blood, old debts, and making sure the ghosts of betrayals past don't get to destroy innocent futures. That evening, in apartment 4C, Henry sat on his bedroom floor surrounded by crayons. John was out. Some business dinner that would probably end with him drunk and angry. Claire was at the hospital pulling another double shift. Henry had the apartment to himself for a few precious hours. He pulled out a fresh piece of paper and started drawing. This time, it wasn't just one man holding his hand. It was 20 figures in dark suits, standing in a protective circle around a small boy. Some were tall, some shorter. One wore what looked like an apron. Dario, he remembered. One had a stern face, but kind eyes. Luca. And in front, hand on the boy's shoulder, stood a man with gray in his hair and absolute certainty in his posture. Above them all, in Henry's careful print, he wrote one word. Family. Not a question this time. A statement. A declaration of something he'd found that he hadn't even known he was looking for. He was adding details, shading the suits, drawing in the SUVs behind them, when his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "This is Luca. Vince wanted you to know. You're not alone. We're watching. You're safe now." Henry stared at the message, his eyes burning with tears he refused to let fall. He typed back with shaking fingers, "Thank you." The response came immediately. "That's what family does, kid. We show up." Henry looked at his drawing, 20 figures who'd appeared in his life like a miracle, like the answer to prayers he'd been whispering to his dead father for 3 years. He picked up a black crayon and added one more detail to each figure, a small chess piece symbol on their lapels. He didn't know why, just that it felt right, felt like they belonged to something bigger than just him. Outside his window, 2 buildings down, Luca sat in his sedan and watched the boys light. Watched shadows move behind curtains. Kept vigil the way soldiers did, knowing that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought with fists or guns. They were fought by simply refusing to look away. By standing between monsters and children. By showing up when everyone else had turned their backs. Luca made a note in his log. 2147 hours. Subject safe. Drawing. First smile observed in 72 hours of surveillance. Then he settled in for another long night of watching. Because the Reggianos protected their own, and Henry Odell, whether he knew it yet or not, was theirs now. John Odell's paranoia had been building for 5 days. Every time he left the apartment, he felt eyes on him. Every car parked on his street looked suspicious. His business partners were asking uncomfortable questions. His lawyer had called 3 times about managing optics. Even the neighbors had started looking at him differently. Mrs. Chen no longer smiled. The superintendent found reasons to avoid conversation. The viral video had done more than embarrass him. It had pulled back the curtain on his carefully constructed image, and John could feel everything he'd built beginning to crack. By Thursday night, drunk and desperate to reassert control, he came home looking for a target. Claire was in the kitchen, still in her scrubs, exhausted from another double shift. She looked up when the door slammed, her face already showing the wary calculation of someone who'd learned to read dangerous moods. "John, I was just making—" "They're watching me." He threw his keys on the counter hard enough to make them skitter across the granite. "Your kids' new friends. I see their cars, black SUVs circling the block, following me to work. I'm sure it's just—" "Don't." John stepped closer, and Claire instinctively backed against the counter. "Don't tell me I'm imagining it. Don't tell me I'm paranoid. Your son went crying to the mob and now they think they can intimidate me in my own neighborhood." Henry didn't. He was just scared. Of what? Of discipline? Of structure? John's voice rose. "I've given that kid everything. A home, food, clothes. And this is how he repays me? By making me look weak in front of the entire city? He's 10 years old, John. He doesn't understand. He understands exactly what he did." John's hand shot out, grabbing Claire's arm hard enough to make her wince. And you let him. You probably encouraged it. Probably told him stories about what a monster I am while I'm out working to support this family. I never, Claire's voice cracked. John, please, you're hurting me. His other hand rose, palm open, and Claire closed her eyes, bracing for impact. Outside, 50 feet away in a dark sedan, Luca's hand moved to his door handle. Not yet, Dario said quietly, his own body tensed like a spring ready to release. Boss said to wait for escalation. That looks pretty escalated to me. Physical contact, not violence. Yet. Dario's eyes never left the window. We move too soon. It's harassment. We wait for him to cross the line. Luca reached for the switch they'd installed on the dashboard. A remote trigger connected to a device Martha had placed on the building's exterior electrical box 2 nights ago. He flipped it. Inside the apartment, just as John's hand began its arc toward Claire's face, every light in the apartment flickered once, twice. Then the porch light outside their window began flashing in a steady, deliberate rhythm. On, off, on, off. Not a power surge. Too controlled. Too purposeful. John's hand froze mid-swing. He turned toward the window, confusion giving way to something else as his eyes adjusted to the darkness outside. 2 silhouettes stood on the sidewalk directly across from his building. Men in dark suits, hands clasped in front of them, absolutely motionless. The porch lights flashing illuminated them in strobe-like intervals. There, not there, not there. Watching. Just watching. Not approaching, not threatening. Just present. What the? John's voice came out strangled. He released Claire and moved to the window, pressing his face against the glass. The silhouettes didn't move, didn't acknowledge his staring, just stood with the patient stillness of men who had all the time in the world. John backed away from the window, his bravado draining like water through a sieve. They're outside. They're right there, watching the apartment. Claire rubbed her arm where his fingers had left red marks. Maybe you should... Shut up. But the command had no force behind it. John looked at his hands like they'd betrayed him, then back at the window where the 2 figures remained statue still. They can't do this. This is harassment. I could call the police. He reached for his phone, but his hands were shaking too badly to dial. Because John Odell, who'd spent years using his size and connections to intimidate, had just discovered what it felt like to be afraid in his own home. To know that someone was watching, waiting, ready to intervene if he crossed a line he could no longer see clearly. He lowered his hand, the one that had been seconds from striking Claire. Looked at the window again where the silhouettes remained unmoved. Then, without another word, he grabbed his jacket and fled the apartment. Claire stood alone in the kitchen, her arms still throbbing, listening to his footsteps echo down the stairwell. The porch light stopped flashing. Through the window, she saw the 2 figures nod once to each other, then disappear into the shadows like they'd never been there at all. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. You and Henry. Pack a bag, 1 hour. Someone will come to the door. Trust us. Claire stared at the message, her hands trembling. This was insane. These were criminals, mobsters, people she should be afraid of. But as she looked at her arm, at the red marks that would be bruises by morning, she realized she was already afraid. Had been afraid for 3 years, just of the wrong people. She texted back, "Who is this?" The response came immediately, family. An hour later, Martha arrived at apartment 4C dressed in an expensive coat and heels. Looking every inch the successful businesswoman rather than the mafia strategist she actually was. Henry answered the door, his backpack already on, clutching his father's watch. Claire stood behind him with a single duffel bag, her face pale but determined. "You're really doing this?" Claire asked. "Taking us in? We don't have money. Can't pay you back." "We're not asking for payment." Martha's voice was calm, professional. "Vince sent me. He wants you both somewhere safe while we handle the John Odell situation. Handle it how? Legally, thoroughly, permanently. Martha's smile was thin. But that takes time. And in the meantime, Henry needs to not live in fear. You're criminals, Claire said, the words barely above a whisper. Everyone knows what the Reggiano family is. Martha didn't flinch. We are, but right now, we're the only ones standing between your son and a man who buys judges and buries police reports. Sometimes the system fails. When it does, people like us show up. And what happens when you're done handling John? What do we owe you? Nothing. Martha looked at Henry, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. Except maybe to remember that family isn't always the people you're born to. Sometimes it's the people who show up when no one else will. Claire looked at her son, his bruised eye fading but still visible, his small hand clutching hers so tight it hurt. Okay, she whispered. Okay. They followed Martha down the stairs, past Mrs. Chen's door, where the older woman watched through her peephole, but didn't intervene, past the superintendent who suddenly had paperwork to review. Outside, Luca and Dario waited by a black SUV, their presence a shield between Claire, Henry, and anyone who might question where they were going. As they drove away from apartment 4C, Henry looked back at the building one last time. Then he turned to Martha. Is this real? His voice was small. Are we really safe now? Martha reached over and squeezed his shoulder gently. Kid, you've got 20 uncles who'd go to war for you. You're safer than you've ever been. Henry nodded, and for the first time in 3 years, he believed it. Behind them, in the apartment they'd left, John eventually returned to find them gone. No note, no explanation, just empty rooms and the echo of footsteps that would never return. He stood in the kitchen, staring at the window where the silhouettes had been, and understood with perfect clarity. The Reggianos had his family now. And there wasn't a judge, cop, or politician in his pocket who could do anything about it. Because some debts couldn't be paid with money, some could only be paid by letting go of what you never deserved to hold in the first place. The townhouse sat tucked between 2 residential buildings in Brooklyn, invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. Martha had owned it through shell corporations for years, a safe house for when things went sideways, when protection meant disappearing. Claire sat on the leather sofa, hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. Henry was upstairs, finally sleeping after Martha had read him 3 chapters of some adventure book about kids who found treasure. Vince sat across from her, patience wearing thin, but still holding. Mrs. Odell, Claire. We need to know everything if we're going to protect you properly. I've told you everything. But her voice shook, and her eyes wouldn't meet his. Martha, standing by the window, turned slowly. No, you haven't. You've told us about the abuse, the corruption, John's connections. She moved closer, her voice gentler, but no less firm. What you haven't told us is why. Why what? Why a successful real estate developer with political connections chose a widowed nurse with a 10-year-old son. Martha sat on the arm of the sofa. Men like John Odell don't pursue relationships out of love. They pursue them for control, for access, for something they want. Claire's hands trembled around the cold cup. I don't know what your husband. Vince leaned forward, elbows on his knees. David Connolly. Tell us about him. The cup slipped from Claire's fingers, tea spilling across expensive carpet neither of them noticed. How do you know David's name? I make it my business to know things. Vince's voice went soft. Especially when someone connected to Marco Tonetti gets involved with one of my people. Who's Marco? Don't. Martha's word cut clean. We've been watching John for days. We've seen his files, his connections, his history. We know he worked with Tonetti. What we don't know is why he targeted your family specifically. Claire's face crumbled like paper held too close to flame. David was a forensic accountant. He worked for the city, investigating financial crimes. Her voice broke. 3 years ago, he found something, evidence of money laundering through construction projects. Millions of dollars moving through shell companies. Vince and Martha exchanged glances. One name kept appearing in the files David was building, Claire continued, words spilling faster now, like a dam finally breaking. John Odell Development Group. He was planning to turn everything over to federal prosecutors. But he never got the chance, Vince said quietly. Car accident, single vehicle collision on a wet road. Claire's laugh was hollow, broken. Police said he lost control, but David was the most careful driver I knew, and that morning, before he left for work, he told me, her voice cracked. He told me if anything happened to him, to check his office safe, that he'd hidden backup files. Did you? John was at the funeral. So charming, so concerned. Helped with arrangements, brought us meals. Made sure we were okay. Tears tracked down her face. By the time I thought to check David's office, it had been cleaned out. The safe was empty. And John was always there, always helpful, always... She stopped, understanding flooding her features. Always watching, making sure I never looked too closely. From the stairway came a small sound, half gasp, half sob. They all turned to see Henry standing on the landing, his father's watch clutched in both hands, his face pale as bone. Henry. Claire stood, but the boy backed away. Dad didn't die in an accident. His voice was small, distant, like he was speaking from somewhere far away. John killed him. That's why he's here. That's why he hurts us. Because we're what? Evidence, Vince said gently. You and your mother. Proof that he got away with murder. Henry's legs gave out. He sat hard on the stairs, the watch pressing against his chest like it could somehow connect him to the father he'd lost. All this time I thought if I was just better, just quieter, just... None of this is your fault, kid. Vince moved to the stairs, lowering himself to Henry's level with careful precision. None of it. You understand me? He killed my dad. The words came out broken, each syllable weighted with understanding that no 10-year-old should carry. And then he moved into our house and... Henry looked at his mother. Did you know? No, baby, I swear. But you suspected. Henry's eyes were old suddenly, too old. That's why you always looked so scared, not just of him hitting us, of what he could do if we ever tried to leave. Claire nodded, tears flowing freely now. I'm so sorry. I should have been braver. Should have protected you better. Vince stood, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. He walked to the window where Martha waited, and together they stared out at Brooklyn's lights, while behind them, a mother and son held each other and grieved for truths that should have stayed buried. You were right, Vince said quietly. This isn't about protecting a child from abuse anymore. No. Martha's voice was ice and iron. This is about finishing something we should have finished when Tinetti betrayed us. About ending the last poisonous thread he left behind. Vince poured himself a drink, expensive scotch that burned going down, but did nothing to cool the rage building in his chest. Family meeting. Tonight. Everyone. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, Vince said, his eyes reflecting city lights like cold stars, that John Odell has spent 3 years believing he's untouchable, believing money and connections make him immune to consequences. He turned to face Martha. We're going to show him what happens when you take everything from someone who has nothing left to lose. Violence won't... I'm not talking about violence. Vince's smile was sharp and terrible. We don't kill him, Martha. We end him. We take his money, his reputation, his connections, his freedom. We make sure that when he falls so far there's no climbing back. Martha studied her brother for a long moment. Then she nodded. I'll make the calls. How much time do we have? however long it takes to do this right. Vince looked back at Henry, still clutching his father's watch like a lifeline. That boy's been waiting 3 years for justice. We're going to give it to him. Without becoming monsters ourselves? That's the only way it works. Vince finished his drink. We show the world who John Odell really is. Every crime, every bribe, every life he destroyed. We bury him in truth. Martha's smile matched her brother's, cold and certain and absolutely merciless. Then let's get to work. Outside, 20 SUVs waited in the Brooklyn darkness. Not a threat this time. A promise that some debts could only be paid in exposure, in justice, in the slow, inevitable collapse of empires built on lies. And the Reggianos always collected their debts. John Odell's silver BMW screeched to a halt outside Franklin Elementary at 11:47 a.m. News vans were already there. He'd made sure of it, playing the wronged stepfather for cameras. Inside, Henry sat in Mrs. Alvarez's classroom, pencil frozen over a math worksheet when he heard the commotion in the hallway. That voice, the one from his nightmares. "Henry!" Mrs. Alvarez speed-dialed Martha. "He's here. Lock your door. We're 2 minutes out." But 2 minutes was too long. John burst through the school entrance, brushing past Principal Morrison with entitled fury. "I'm his legal guardian. I'm taking him home. Now." Down the hallway, past frozen teachers, straight to room 204. His fist slammed against the locked door. Once. Twice. The lock gave way. John stormed in, his carefully constructed facade crumbling into pure rage. His eyes found Henry behind Mrs. Alvarez's desk. "You!" He crossed the room in 3 strides. "You embarrassed me, you little—" His hand shot out, fingers clamping around Henry's arm like a vice, yanking him up hard enough to lift his feet off the ground. Henry cried out. That's when the sound started. Low, distant, growing impossibly louder until the windows vibrated and conversations died mid-word. 20 black SUVs rounded the corner in perfect formation, filling Maple Street end to end. Their engines synchronized in a thunderous chorus that shook the building. John's face went pale. Through the window, he watched the vehicles stop in perfect unison. 3 seconds of silence. Then every door opened at once. Men emerged in dark suits, pressed, professional, moving with military precision. They formed a wall between the school and the media, their presence speaking louder than words. From the lead SUV, Vince Reggiano stepped out. He adjusted his cufflinks, lit a cigar, then walked toward the entrance with the quiet certainty of someone who'd spent decades making people listen without raising his voice. Behind him, 20 men fell into formation. Their footsteps echoed in the hallway. Deliberate, measured, coming closer. Vince appeared in the doorway. He didn't speak immediately, just stood there, cigar smoke drifting, his dark eyes taking in the scene, John's hand on Henry's arm, the boy's tears, the red marks where fingers dug too deep. Behind Vince, the hallway had filled with suited figures. Luca, Dario, Martha, all of them, silent as tombstones. Let go of the boy. 4 words, quiet, calm, absolute. John's hand trembled. This is my family. You have no right. Vince took 1 step forward. The temperature dropped. I said, his voice went softer, more dangerous. Let go of the boy. Teachers pressed against lockers, students watched with wide eyes. Cameras outside captured everything, this moment that would be replayed millions of times. Not violence, protection. Vince moved closer until he stood 3 feet from John. His eyes never left the hand gripping Henry's arm. You heard him again, Vince said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of coming thunder. And you'll pray for prison. The words hung like a verdict. John's fingers opened. Henry stumbled backward, free. Luca moved with fluid grace, stepping between them. Come on, kid. You're okay now. Henry didn't hesitate. He moved toward Luca, letting the big man shield him. The other men shifted without a word, forming a wall of suits between Henry and John. Not aggressive, not threatening, just present, immovable. Their hands at their sides, expressions calm, but their message absolute. Touch him again, and discover what happens when family protects its own. John looked at them, 20 men standing between him and a child he'd terrorized, and something broke. The confidence crumbled. The rage drained, leaving only pathetic desperation. "You can't do this," his voice shook. "I have rights. You're criminals." "We're citizens," Vince interrupted calmly, "concerned about a child's welfare. That boy asked for help. We showed up. Nothing illegal about that." "He's mine." "He's not." Martha's voice cut through. She held up a folder. "David Connolly was his father. You're just the man who moved in after David was murdered." John's face went crimson. "How dare! How dare I tell the truth?" Martha's smile was winter cold. "You should hope that's all I tell." Principal Morrison found her voice. "Mr. Odell, leave, now." Mrs. Alvarez stepped forward, tiny but fierce. "These men haven't raised their voices, haven't touched anyone, haven't broken down doors." She looked at Vince, then John. "They've just stood between a child and someone who hurts him. That's not criminal. That's called being decent." John straightened his suit with shaking hands, trying to salvage dignity. "This isn't over," he said, forcing strength into his voice. "My attorneys, call them." Vince's certainty was unshakable. "Call your lawyers, your judges, everyone in your pocket." He flicked cigar ash. "Then ask yourself if any of them will stand with you when the world knows who you really are." Real fear flickered across John's face. He backed toward the door, trying to maintain composure while retreating. Nobody responded. The 20 men just watched him go, silent as monuments, their stillness more powerful than any threat. John's footsteps echoed, the front door slammed. Through windows, everyone watched him flee to his BMW, cameras tracking every step. He drove away fast, tires squealing. The tension broke. Henry stood surrounded by 20 suited men, safe behind their wall, looking at Vince with wonder. "Thank you," he whispered. Vince crouched to his level. "That's what family does, kid. We show up." Outside, a photographer captured the moment, 20 men in dark suits forming a protective circle around one small boy. Not a weapon visible, not a threat spoken, just absolute solidarity. The image would be everywhere by evening, viral within hours, strength without violence. Protection without brutality. Power used not to destroy, but to shield. For Henry, standing in that circle for the first time in 3 years, the world felt different. Safer. Like maybe monsters could be stopped without becoming one yourself. Like maybe family wasn't about blood or legal documents. It was about who showed up when everyone else looked away. And the Reggianos always showed up. Luca moved with fluid grace, stepping between them and gently guiding Henry away. "Come on, kid. You're okay now." The other men shifted position without a word, forming a wall of suits between Henry and John. Not aggressive, not threatening, just present, immovable. John looked at them, then at Vince, then at the cameras outside capturing everything. His lawyer's mind was calculating. Assault charges, kidnapping accusations. Ways to spin this narrative back in his favor. "You can't do this," he said, voice shaking despite his attempt at authority. "I have rights, legal guardianship. You're criminals interfering with—" "We're citizens," Vince interrupted calmly. "Attending a public school event, concerned about a child's welfare." He took a long drag on his cigar. "That boy asked us to be here. We showed up. Nothing illegal about that." "He's my son." "He's not." Martha's voice cut from behind the wall of men. She held up a folder, crisp and official-looking. "David Connolly was his father. You're just the man who moved in after David died." John's face went red. How dare you? How dare I what? Tell the truth? Martha's smile was cold. You should hope I stop there, because there's so much more truth I could tell. For a moment, John looked like he might lunge, might try to force his way through 20 men to reclaim what he thought belonged to him. Then he saw it, the way they stood. Relaxed, but ready. Not a single hand near a weapon, not a single threat spoken, but their presence said everything their words didn't. Touch that boy again, and you'll discover what protection really means. Principal Morrison found her voice. Mr. Odell, I think you should leave. I'm not leaving without— Yes, you are. Mrs. Alvarez stepped forward, her tiny frame somehow larger than John's rage. Because unlike you, these men haven't raised their voices, haven't touched anyone, haven't threatened. She looked at Vince, then back at John. They've just stood between a child and someone who's hurt him. That's not criminal. That's called being a decent human being. John's lawyer instincts kicked in. He straightened his suit, forced his face into something resembling composure, and addressed the cameras he knew were watching. This isn't over. I'll be speaking with my attorneys about this harassment, this interference with— Do that. Vince's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Talk to your lawyers, your judges, your friends in high places. He flicked ash from his cigar. Then ask yourself if any of them will help when the world knows exactly who you are. Something in John's expression cracked. Fear, real and raw, flickered across his face before he could hide it. He backed toward the door, trying to maintain dignity while retreating. You'll regret this. All of you. Nobody responded. The 20 men just watched him go, silent as monuments, while Henry stood safe behind their wall. John's footsteps echoed down the empty hallway. The school's front door slammed. Through the windows, everyone watched him stride to his BMW with false confidence, cameras tracking every step. He drove away fast, tires squealing. The tension broke like a fever. Mrs. Alvarez exhaled shakily. Principal Morrison leaned against a locker. Students whispered to each other, eyes wide, already turning this into legend. Henry stood surrounded by 20 suited men, looking at Vince with something like worship. Thank you, he whispered. Vince crouched to his level, gentle despite his reputation. That's what family does, kid. We show up. But he said he'd come back, that this isn't over. He's right about one thing. Vince's smile held no warmth. It's not over, but not because he's coming back. Because we're making sure he never can. Outside, a photographer captured the moment. 20 men in dark suits forming a protective circle around one small boy. Not a weapon drawn, not a threat spoken, just absolute solidarity. The image would be on every news site by evening. Strength without violence, protection without brutality, power used not to intimidate, but to shield. The caption would read, "When the system fails, who protects the children?" But for Henry, standing in that circle of certainty, the answer was simple. Family did. Real family. The kind that showed up when everyone else looked away. The kind that stood between children and monsters, that used their power to protect instead of destroy. Can we go? Henry asked quietly. I don't want to be here anymore. Yeah, kid. Luca placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Let's go home. Home. Not the apartment where John had ruled through fear. Not the place where bruises were covered and voices were silenced. Home. The townhouse in Brooklyn where Martha made hot chocolate and Dario taught him to cook pasta and 20 dangerous men treated him like something precious instead of broken. As they walked out of Franklin Elementary, Henry between Vince and Luca, surrounded by protection he'd only dreamed about in crayon drawings, he felt something shift. For 3 years he'd been shrinking, making himself smaller, quieter, trying to disappear so he wouldn't get hurt. Now, surrounded by men who saw him as worth protecting, he stood straighter. Outside, the SUVs waited. Doors opened, engines idled. And somewhere in Manhattan, Martha was already making calls, assembling evidence, preparing the final move that would end John Odell not with violence, but with truth. Because the Reggianos had learned something important. Sometimes the most devastating weapon wasn't a gun or a threat. It was simply refusing to look away when monsters depended on silence, and they would never look away again. 3 days after the schoolyard confrontation, Vince Reggiano sat across from investigative journalist Sarah Chen in a coffee shop in Lower Manhattan. Between them on the table, a manila folder containing 3 years of carefully documented evidence. "You understand what you're asking me to do?" Sarah's pen hovered over her notepad, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. She'd built her career exposing corruption, but this was different. Bigger. "I'm not asking." Vince pushed the folder toward her. "I'm giving you the story of the year. Maybe the decade." Sarah opened the folder. Her expression shifted from skepticism to shock as she flipped through pages: bank records, witness statements, surveillance photos, text message logs between John Odell and the officials he'd bought. "This is Judge Torres, Captain Brennan, half the family court system." She looked up. "You're handing me a corruption scandal that goes all the way to a murdered forensic accountant whose death was ruled an accident 3 years ago." Vince's voice was calm, factual. David Connolly was investigating money laundering. John Odell had him killed, then moved in on his widow and son to make sure no evidence surfaced. "You can prove this?" "Every word." Martha spent 2 weeks building that case. Financial records showing payments to the mechanic who tampered with Connolly's brakes. Phone logs placing Odell at the scene. Witness testimony from people who were too scared to talk before. He paused. Now they're not scared anymore. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she absorbed what she was holding. "Why give this to me? Why not just—" She stopped, reconsidering. "Never mind. I know what people say about your family. They say we're criminals." Vince allowed himself a small smile. "They're not wrong, but we don't hurt children, and we don't let men who do walk away clean. The boy at the school, that viral video, that was you. That was family." Vince stood, buttoning his coat. "You've got 48 hours before I give this to every other journalist in the city. If you want the exclusive, I suggest you start making calls." He walked to the door, then paused. "One more thing. The boy's name stays out of this. He's been through enough. This story is about the corruption, about the system that failed him, not about making him a headline." Sarah nodded slowly. "Mr. Reggiano, why trust me with this?" "Because 2 years ago you exposed that ring of dirty cops in Brooklyn. You didn't sensationalize it. You didn't make it entertainment. You just told the truth." Vince's eyes held hers. "That's all I'm asking for now. The truth." He left without waiting for a response. By the next morning, Sarah Chen's byline was on the front page of the New York Times. "Empire of Silence: How One Developer Bought a System and Got Away with Murder." The article detailed everything: the corruption network, the buried abuse reports, the suspicious death of David Connolly. Within hours, federal prosecutors announced investigations. By afternoon, arrest warrants were issued. John Odell was taken into custody at his office, cameras capturing him in handcuffs, his perfect facade finally shattered beyond repair. Fraud, bribery, obstruction of justice, and murder. Judge Torres resigned before they could remove him. Captain Brennan was suspended pending investigation. Patricia Mendez at Child Services was fired and arrested for corruption. The system John had built to protect himself collapsed in 48 hours. At the Brooklyn townhouse, Henry watched the news with Claire and Martha, his small hand gripping his father's watch. "Is it really over?" he asked quietly. "The legal part?" Martha nodded. "Yes, Odell will spend the rest of his life in prison. The people who helped him hide will face justice too. And us? You're safe. Vince walked in from the kitchen, carrying 3 cups of hot chocolate. Martha's idea, something normal kids did. You and your mom can go home whenever you're ready, or stay here as long as you need. Your choice. Henry looked at his mother, who squeezed his hand. Maybe we stay a few more days, Claire said softly. Just to be sure. Take all the time you need. Vince settled into the armchair across from them. The apartment's being cleaned. New locks. Security system. Nobody gets near you again without us knowing about it. 3 weeks later, Henry stood outside Reggiano's restaurant, backpack on both shoulders, his sneakers new and properly sized. The bruises had faded completely. More importantly, something in his eyes had changed. The fear replaced by quiet confidence. Vince was waiting at the door, cigar in hand. Didn't expect to see you here, kid. Mom's working a day shift. She said I could visit if I wanted. Henry shifted his weight nervously. Is that okay? More than okay. Vince opened the door. Come on in. Inside, the restaurant was alive with afternoon preparations. Dario was in the kitchen, teaching 2 younger guys how to make proper marinara. Luca sat at the bar going over logistics with Martha. Everyone looked up when Henry entered. There he is, Dario called out, grinning. My favorite food critic. Come tell these idiots why you don't put sugar in the sauce. Henry laughed. A real laugh, the kind that sounded like childhood should. Because you're not making candy? See? The kid gets it. Vince guided Henry to a booth sliding in across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Henry reached into his backpack and pulled out a drawing. It showed 20 figures in suits standing in front of what was clearly Reggiano's restaurant. In the center, a small boy holding hands with a man whose face bore Vince's gray threaded temples and steady eyes. Above them, in careful block letters, family. I wanted you to have this, Henry said quietly, as a thank you for everything. Vince studied the drawing, something tightening in his chest. You drew this? Yeah, I draw a lot. Used to draw pictures asking for a dad. He looked down at his hands. Now I draw pictures of the family I found. 20 uncles is a lot of family, kid. I know. Henry's smile was bright, genuine. Maybe too many. But I'm keeping all of them anyway. Vince folded the drawing carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Tell you what, you need help with homework? Career advice when you're older? Someone to teach you how to throw a proper punch if Kyle ever bothers you again? Kyle transferred schools, Henry said simply. His dad got implicated in some of John's deals. They moved away. Convenient? Yeah. Henry's eyes held understanding beyond his years. Really convenient. They sat in comfortable silence until Dario emerged from the kitchen with 2 plates of pasta, setting them down with theatrical flourish. On the house! Consider it payment for being the bravest kid I ever met. I wasn't brave, Henry said between bites. I was just desperate. Same thing sometimes, Vince replied. Bravery is just desperation pointed in the right direction. 5 years later, Henry Odell stood at 17 outside a newly opened community center in Queens, watching construction workers put the finishing touches on the building. The sign above the entrance read, David Connolly Community Center, a place for every child. Behind him, his mother Claire smiled through tears. Your father would be so proud. I know. Henry's voice had deepened, but his eyes still carried that quiet strength he'd found at 10 years old. That's why I wanted his name on it. The center had been funded anonymously, though Henry knew exactly who'd written the checks. Vince had insisted on keeping it quiet, said it was just good business investing in the community. But Henry knew better. On the wall inside, a bronze plaque read, Family is not blood. Family is who shows up. A low rumble announced their arrival before Henry saw them. 20 black SUVs rolling down the quiet Queen Street, engines purring in perfect synchronization. The vehicles stopped in formation. Doors opened. Vince emerged first, older now, more gray in his temples, but still carrying that unshakable authority. Behind him, Luca, Dario, Martha, and 16 others who'd stood in a school hallway 5 years ago and changed a child's life. "You invited the whole crew?" Claire asked, shaking her head with affection. "Wouldn't be right without them." Henry walked forward to meet Vince, shaking his hand with the firm grip of someone who'd learned confidence from men who wielded power like precision instruments. "The center looks good," Vince said, surveying the building. "Your old man would be proud. You helped make it happen. We just provided resources. You provided the vision." Vince's hand settled on Henry's shoulder, the same gesture from 5 years ago, but now the boy had grown tall enough to nearly meet his eyes. "What's next for you, kid?" "College? Pre-law probably. Maybe I'll become a prosecutor." Henry's smile was knowing. Someone has to make sure the next John Odell doesn't get away with it for 3 years. Martha laughed from behind them. "A Reggiano going into law enforcement. Never thought I'd see the day." "Not a Reggiano," Henry corrected gently. "But family. There's a difference." "Is there?" Vince's eyes held warmth. "You carry our name in everything but paper, kid. You stood up when the world pushed you down. That's what family means." The community center's doors opened. Inside, children from the neighborhood explored the new facility, a safe place with counselors, after-school programs, resources for families in crisis. Everything Henry had needed and couldn't find 5 years ago. As the sun set over Queens, casting golden light across the building that bore his father's name, Henry Odell understood something profound. Family wasn't about the blood in your veins. It was about the people who showed up when darkness came calling, who stood between children and monsters, who used their power not to destroy, but to protect. Behind him, 20 men in dark suits stood watching the center, not as criminals but as guardians, as proof that sometimes the most unexpected people became heroes. That redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about choosing better futures. In the distance, the SUVs waited. Not a threat anymore, never had been for Henry, just a promise kept. Just family, always family. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss it. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as you can ever imagine.